Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. The United States expressed strong support for Japan's new security strategy and defense buildup program. Meanwhile, the South Korean president mentions nuclear armament as a policy option. Today, we'll discuss the security dynamics in Northeast Asia.
핵 자산은 미국의 자산이지만 그것을 운용하는 과정에 한국도 참여를 하고
Japan and the United States remain united in our concern over China's destabilizing actions. And I want to reaffirm the United States' ironclad commitment to defend Japan.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Zumwalt, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was also Ambassador to Republic of Senegal and the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korea's foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Zumwalt, high-level U.S.-Japan meetings in Washington this week was choreographed to reinforce Japan's latest security strategy and the defense build-up program. Secretaries Blinken and Austin emphasized the clear alignment between Tokyo and Washington and also applauded Japan's plans to boost its defense spending. At the center of U.S.'s strong endorsement, is there a desire on the part of the United States to want to see Japan that can fight a war, Japan with offensive military capabilities?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today. This is an interesting week since Japan's foreign and defense ministers and then its prime minister are in Washington for discussions. I think if you think about the U.S. objectives for the region, we're interested in a peaceful region that's open and where countries are free from coercion by any hegemon. And in order to achieve or to sustain this objective, it's very important for the United States to work closely with allies such as Japan and South Korea, Australia, and others. So we very much welcome when our allies take steps to enhance their capabilities. We've welcomed South Korea's intention to increase its defense spending, and we, of course, welcome Japan's interest in enhancing its defense spending as well. You asked about offensive military capabilities, and those, there's been a lot of discussion for years between the United States and Japan about Japan acquiring strike, or now what they call counter-strike capability. And I think the United States is satisfied that this new capability will be integrated into the alliance, and we will be working closely with Japan to utilize this new capability in a way that enhances our shared objectives.
You say as a general proposition that it is good for countries in Asia to grow their military strength to go against a particular hegemon. But for Japan, it's a big jump. Japan had a pacifist constitution, but now it has decided to build up its defense and military. So is there a particular role that U.S. is thinking about Japan playing in this region? And is that why does United States wants to see a Japan that can fight a war?
Yeah. You're right, it is a big jump, but it's a big jump from a very low base. Even after this increase in Japanese defense spending as a percentage of GNP will be less than what South Korea spends on its defense. It'll be roughly on par with our NATO allies as well. So we see this as a positive development and bringing Japan more in line with our other allies in terms of our ability to work together.
Now, counter-strike capability, Secretary Austin said close coordination of employing this capability will strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. Mr. Snyder, in what way would the coordination and the employment of the counter-strike capability strengthen the alliance? And does the United States want Japan to counter-strike China?
Well, I think that it's really more about integration than anything else, and thinking about how to deal with China in the context of a shared approach. And so, especially if there is a specific operational contingency involved, I think that what you just quoted from Secretary Austin suggests that the U.S. very much conceives of Japan in coalition with the U.S. and working together with the U.S. because they're basically on the same page in terms of their strategic view of the region.
And those long-range cruise missiles will hit targets deep inside North Korea and China. And Japan government already said that it does not need to consult with South Korea when striking against North Korea. And South Korea said, of course, absolutely, prior coordination is needed. And South Korea also said that further discussions can be made in a trilateral context with the United States. What advanced coordination do you envision between the three countries?
You know, I do think it's very important for the United States, Korea, and Japan to coordinate closely about this and other issues. And since this is a new capability, it's natural for South Korea to wonder, what is Japanese doctrine? How will this capability, or how could it be used? So I do think these sorts of discussions are very important to build a sense of trust among the three players.
Is this a sovereign decision for Japan to use counterstrike against North Korea? Is there any say for South Korea in this decision?
I think a lot of this is going to depend on the circumstances, and I think that's actually the reason why it's important for the U.S. To move from dealing with extended deterrence issues in the context of two parallel bilateral alliances to a regional context. Because when you're talking about extended deterrence, we can have that conversation with Japan, we can have that conversation with South Korea, but there are so many different possibilities in terms of events that could occur or contingencies that might happen where one side views the need to respond rapidly and strongly as an urgent matter, and the other one might not feel that same sense of urgency. And so that's the reason why I think the U.S. really needs its Japanese and South Korean allies to come together and address extended deterrence in the context of a regional discussion.
Ambassador Zumwalt, are North Korea and China good reasons for Japan to build up its defense, similar to U.S. policy on Japan reversed course during the Korean War and paved the way for remilitarization for Japan?
You know, it's a very good question, and I think years ago when North Korea began developing its medium and long-range missile capabilities, Japan invested a lot in missile defense as the response to that effort. But I think given North Korea's growing capabilities and its demonstration of its ability to launch numerous missiles, Japan decided that missile defense alone was insufficient to defend themselves from this threat. And so the reason for Japan stated for acquiring a counter-strike capability, it's not for, what the government has said is this is not for preemptive use, but rather in response to being attacked by North Korea. What Japan is hoping is this will serve as a deterrent and deter North Korea from considering striking Japan with its missiles.
Mr. Snyder, do you see a parallel between U.S.'s latest endorsement of Japan's military buildup and back in the Korean War when there was a reverse course policy?
Well, I would actually point to something different, and that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine as really a seminal moment from a strategic perspective, especially for Japan, but for the region. Because what we're talking about is the violation of 7-decade-old recognition of international borders that had stood. And so I think that if you're looking at that situation from the perspective of Japan or South Korea, suddenly you have to take into account the possibility that the violation of international borders is no longer sacrosanct, as a principle in international relations, and then you look at the threat environment and you begin to recognize that you need to take on additional responsibilities in the security and defense area.
You talk about the war in Ukraine, but it's not that Russian missile flew over Japan, it was North Korean missile that flew over Japan.
That is correct, but I think that the fact, and North Korea is also a revisionist state, just like Russia is a revisionist state. And so I think that it's a very short line to draw for Japanese security planners to recognize that if something like the invasion of Ukraine can happen, then borders in Northeast Asia may also not be stable. And so I think that that really was the driver, in addition to the North Korean missile flying over Japan. I mean, and of course there's also the China issue. And the question of whether or not China is a revisionist state, and that is a subject of active discussion among some security planners.
Ambassador Zumwalt, one expert puts the U.S. is building up former adversaries as power centers. Another expert says Japan and India are the Asian pillars against the balance of power against China. Now, if we also look at the balance of power perspective, would it pose a dilemma to the United States if Japan grows its military powers beyond China, beyond the desired, what U.S. desires, to become a dominant state in Asia?
I don't think there's any possibility of Japan growing its military to the extent that it is more powerful than China, partly because of its shrinking population, partly because of a strong anti-military feeling amongst many in the Japanese population. So I'm not at all concerned about Japan growing its military to the extent where it threatens its neighbors. Rather, I think what the United States is looking for is a capable ally that can help us achieve our objective of a stable and peaceful region where there's open commerce and countries are free from coercion.
Now, Mr. Snyder, since a decade ago, many scholars posed questions to the possibility of less U.S. military presence in Asia. Now, and Koreans are concerned that Japan can fill the gap and grow the military in Asia. So is that something South Korea should be concerned about? Or should South Korea prepare in advance and boost up cooperation with Japan?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question because at one time, at various times, there are concerns about U.S. durability of its presence that bubble up. And what I've noticed, for instance, in conversations with former South Korean diplomats, is that when those concerns really start to bubble up, occasionally, kind of jokingly, they'll say, well, I guess we're going to have to cooperate more with Japan, right? Because of the concern about U.S. staying power. And so I do think that that is an issue, and just because they're joking about it doesn't mean that it would be easy or that it's likely to happen, but I think that the default response under current circumstances, where China is the most likely hegemon, is actually for Japan and South Korea to try to band together in order to try to counter that dominance by China.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Snyder, President Yoon Suk-yeol in a recent interview said joint nuclear planning and execution with the U.S. included tabletop exercises, computer simulations, and drills on delivery means for nuclear weapons. Except for tabletop exercises, which we heard before, other elements were unveiled by President Yoon. Do you think there is some real progress in joint nuclear planning discussions?
Well, I think so. It's evident in the Security Council, the SCM meetings that were held back in November, where those tabletop exercises were announced. But that was in the context of a range of nuclear planning activities. And it makes sense because North Korea's doctrine also has become more clear. North Korea's mention of nuclear preemption suggests a direct need for planning in the context of a contingency related to nuclear use on the peninsula.
Ambassador Zumwalt, ultimately, the United States president has the final decision on using the nuclear weapons. To what extent do you think would the United States be willing to share its nuclear assets with South Korea?
Well, the position of the United States government is a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So the purpose of our nuclear capability is to deter adversaries from using nuclear weapons. And so in that context, it's very important for the United States to work closely with South Korea. We have this channel called the Extended Deterrence Dialogue. And the purpose of that dialogue is to enhance trust so that South Korea understands American doctrine, they understand American capabilities, and they understand in what circumstances we would resort to using a nuclear weapon in response to an attack on South Korea. So the goal of this is really to enhance trust. We have a similar dialogue, as Scott mentioned, with Japan.
Now, Mr. Snyder, President Yoon Suk-yeol, for the first time since taking office, he talked about the nuclear option as a policy option. And he said if North Korea's provocation level intensifies, South Korea can redeploy U.S. nuclear tactical weapons or possess its own nuclear weapons. We'll be able to have nuclear weapons quickly with our level of science and technology. Now, is this the manifestation of the public sentiment coming out through the president of South Korea? And have we reached the point where U.S. just emphasizing extended deterrence will not really satisfy the South Korean public?
Well, I do think that the president's comments suggest that there is domestic public pressure on him as related to questions related to the credibility of extended deterrence. And I do think that it may signal that the two governments have actually found themselves a little bit behind the public desire to see this set of issues addressed, and they need to do some things in order to catch up. I think that the core of the issue is actually the difference between what extended deterrence looks like if you are in South Korea and what extended deterrence looks like if you're in the United States. And the core issue there is really how do you show that extended deterrence is credible on the peninsula. You know, one joke that occurs in the context of financial crises is that the best way to solve the financial crisis is to fly a 747 into the country that has the financial crisis that is full of US dollars. And in some ways, I think that the desire for tactical nuclear weapons redeployment in South Korea is very similar to that. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, does flying the plane into the country that has the financial crisis with US dollars actually solve the crisis? And I think that it turns out sometimes to be more complicated than that. But I do believe that there is going to be an ongoing need for the US to lean forward in terms of showing that it is proactive in terms of addressing some of these issues. And I actually have two suggestions on that front. One, I think that there needs to be a more active discussion of South Korean and Japanese involvement in Five Eyes intelligence coordination. And two, I think that the Biden administration is going to have to end up elevating the attention that it gives to the North Korea issue to the White House.
The domestic pressure stems from the realization of the existential threat coming from North Korea, which vows to first strike South Korea. Is there something that needs to be done about addressing that existential threat?
Yes, and I think that that is precisely what the two governments are trying to do through the extended deterrence dialogue. But we also have to understand that North Korea can use its actions in order to try to amplify disagreement between the US and South Korea on these issues. And my concern is that the near-term target of North Korean provocations in 2023 may actually be sowing of dissension between the US and South Korea that may actually play on South Korean public concerns about the credibility of US extended deterrence. And that is something that we need to be very careful about avoiding falling into that trap.
Ambassador Zumwalt, China suspended issuing short-term and transit visa to people from Japan and South Korea as a first-rounder retaliation against countries that impose strict COVID testing on passengers coming from China. Now, is China applying domestic revenge on a virus control measure? Is this proportionate?
No, I don't think it's proportionate, but I do think it shows how China is willing to use a coercion to try and influence its neighbors. In the case of the United States, Korea, and Japan, each nation has imposed some kind of screening mechanism on travelers coming in from China. The appropriate response from China would have been to be more transparent, because the concerns are about new variants that might be emerging, and if China were sharing more information with the United States, Japan, and Korea, maybe we'd be comfortable then getting rid of these screening mechanisms. But instead, China has imposed travel bans from Korea and Japan. Interestingly, they did not impose that ban on the United States, and I think that shows that China is wary about using coercion against the United States, but not wary about using coercion against smaller nations in its periphery.
Now, Mr. Snyder, do you see a parallel with the revenge over THAAD deployment? And what should be South Korean message to China, which typically resorts to retaliation?
Well, actually, I think that President Yoon had this exactly right when he said that, well, the South Korean Foreign Ministry needs to explain to China the scientific basis upon which South Korea is imposing the restrictions on entry for Chinese visitors. And I actually think that this is really probably more of a temporary problem. I don't see it as having yet the ramifications that THAAD retaliation has had, because in all likelihood, the outbreak in China will be contained at some point within the next few months, and a lot of these restrictions will end up being lifted.
Now, Ambassador Zumwalt, the U.S. and Japan vowed broad-based cooperation against China's assertiveness, and the alliance posture will put to test during a Taiwan contingency. And Japan is very clear about it is willing to get militarily involved in a case of a Taiwan contingency. South Korea is not as clear. Do you think South Korea should also send out a clear message that it will join forces with the United States in the case of a Taiwan contingency? Would that something the U.S. wants to hear?
Well, obviously, that's up to South Korea to determine. But I think the reason Japan has made these or taken these steps is that Japan's interests would be gravely affected if China were to attack or to take over Taiwan. So much of trade that Japan engages with the world passes near Taiwan, and if China were to gain control of that part of the Pacific, that would have a big impact on Japan's security and its economy. So Korea needs to look at its own interests and make a decision whether it makes sense to work together more with the United States in contingency planning, for example.
Mr. Snyder, the U.S. and Japan clearly reiterated that China is the greatest shared strategic challenge, but Korea didn't call China as a threat in its latest Indo-Pacific strategy, rather called China as a partner for prosperity and peace in the region. Do you think even in rhetorics, South Korea should clearly align more with the United States and define China as a threat?
Well, I think the important thing is that South Korea is aligned with the United States, and I think that that is evident in South Korea's decision to issue an Indo-Pacific strategy in the first place, alongside the US and Canada and many other countries. But in terms of actually calling out China, that is, I think that decision should be made based on South Korea's own conception of its security interests, not because the US is asking South Korea to do it. And if South Korea decides that it wants to be more active, then it'll be welcome. But I'm not sure that I, as an American analyst, should be calling on the South Korean government necessarily to align with the US conception of interest, because South Korea is geographically closer, it faces a greater risk of economic retaliation, as we've just discussed, and it just has a slightly different metric for grappling with the right way of managing its relationship with China.
Washington Policy Circle were not happy when South Korea called China a strategic partner in the previous administration.
Well, that was the previous administration, and I think that the Yoon administration has adapted a different approach to China. It's not one that says, well, we're going to work with China on the economic side and work with the US on the security side. It's actually one that says, we are aligned with the United States in support of a rules-based order and freedom, yet we still want to try to have a constructive relationship with China. We're not declaring it a zero-sum relationship, but the alignment, I think, is clear.
On that note, we'll end our discussion here. Ambassador Zumwalt, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.